And we have yet another guest in our studio this morning. And
today is a double header of guests. Yes.
Wow. And this is a little short notice, so I have a confession to make that I have not read Michael McCord's book, but I cannot wait to hear all about it. Our guest is Michael McCord, who lives in Exeter and is an award-winning journalist and writer. He used to work for the Portsmouth Herald from 2004 to 2008. He was on the staff, first as business editor and then political editor. He wrote the Out on a Limb economic and political column, which I remember. And he has now written a brand new book. It's a political satire called The Execution Channel, a political fable. And this is his first published novel. And welcome, Michael McCord, to Wake Up.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Larry. How are you doing today?
Doing
Good,
great.
good. Well, reading about there also was an article in the Herald about your book yesterday. And it sounds to me like it's a science fiction book about what would happen in America if John Galt, the hero of Ayn Rand's book Atlas Shrugged, became leader in the United States. I have to take a breath now because that's a pretty scary thought. Is that exactly what your book is about?
Well, I wouldn't say he would become the leader. He's still a fictional character, only he's deified, like Jesus. And so he is praised to no end, and he's spoken about, he's used, there's a term in my book called the Galtian imperatives, which refers to this new economic and civic religion which everybody worships, but nobody quite understands. Nobody really knows what they are. Nobody knows if they're really going to work or what they might do, but everybody feels better worshiping it. And essentially the Galtian imperatives are pretty much whatever the guardians of Galt, who are the top 0.05%, say that they are. So, for example, that means austerity, getting rid of government, and by the way, not only getting rid of government, but getting rid of the idea of government. So it's a whole elimination factor. And, of course, tax cuts and tax advantages, for the guardians of Galt, the makers, the creators, the geniuses. And what I've done is imagine 5 years from now, and I've talked about this a little bit, with people. They say, where'd you come up with this idea? Well, this has been building for, I would say, 3 decades. And I would go back to the first presidential campaign, that I covered, which was in 1980, the presidential primary that Ronald Reagan won. And then a year later, his inaugural address, he talked about, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And it began, I think it's pretty safe to say, 3+ decades of the whole idea of delegitimizing government. Yeah. I don't think there's much doubt about that. It kind of built over the years. And it created this dynamic of where Republicans, and especially conservative Republicans, talked, I guess, tough about, economics and physical restraint, but they destroyed the budget. They just blew up the budget deficit beyond measure because they weren't going to raise taxes. And then that creates the pressure that we're feeling today.
Yeah.
And then we go to the 90s, with the 1994, Republican Revolution, the contract with America. And some would say on America, but that's another matter. And then that kind of built, and there was a kind of revolutionary fervor then. I think you remember that I believe culminated in the Clinton impeachment. Yeah. And it had nothing to do with what kind of infidelity, foolishness that Bill Clinton did. It had everything to do with the fact that they could do it. Mm-hmm. And then we had George W. Bush. And I think you remember back in 2003 and 2004 when the Iraq War wasn't quite turning out the way they thought it was going to turn out. And then you had all these discussions by his White House staff about, well, you reporters are dealing in like this reality world. We're kind of creating this, this thing that people understand and they accept. And then let's take another step to 2009. Which I thought was a pivotal year. Obviously, 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, But the Tea Party, when I started covering this stuff, I was astounded. Not because of the anger. I mean, there's no doubt that when the economy tanked, there was anger to go around all across the board. Mm-hmm. But what I found truly amazing is that the type of stuff that on the extreme that you see occasionally pop up now became mainstream. Whether it became, the whole birther nonsense. And one of the things I do in my book is that the fictional president that's the target of the scorn of the real American Party, which is the creation in my book, is that they're so furious with him and they accuse him of being a total fraud because he was born in Africa and Indonesia simultaneously. So then we had that, and I talked to a lot of people at some of I think you remember the town hall meetings, especially here in the second congressional district with the first congressional district with Carol Shea Porter. They were about the Affordable Care Act, which had not been passed yet, and we had all this nonsense talk about death panels and socialization. Now anybody who's covered this, and believe me, I wrote my first healthcare story. I don't know if you remember, but way back in the 1980s, do you remember when HMOs were going to save the day?
Yes.
Well, we've gone through 3 decades of figuring it out. Now, people don't know this, but essentially what happened in Massachusetts in 2006 and essentially what we call Obamacare now, these are deeply conservative Republican ideas. They're whole built on it. And for them to totally disown it now, essentially they were created in the Heritage Foundation of all places. To disown it now is almost beyond, belief. To call it socialized medicine, in Britain with their National Health Service, now that's socialized medicine.
Right.
There's no question about that. This is not. This is essentially a boon for the, private insurance industry. There's no question about that. It is essentially a quasi-private sector solution. Thank God at least we're doing it because it's I think it's an important first step. I kind of gag when I think about it, but and I covered President Obama during the campaign. He talked about the public option every time, and now out the window. So 2009. Well, I had a most interesting conversation. I remember that event when President Obama came to Portsmouth. And they had on one side of the street at the high school,
I was there.
I was there too.
And the guy with the gun strapped.
Oh my God! I was crazy.
And Obama said never said anything about guns. Never, ever,
no,
nothing.
Right.
And I talked to 2 or 3 of the people, including this one elderly lady who was carrying a sign about FEMA death camps. Now, this is stuff she was getting from Glenn Beck or some
FEMA death camps.
Or Newsmax or somewhere. I don't know where she was getting it. And I'm talking to her, and she's talking about brown shirts and taking away her Medicare. And something clicked, and I said, no, this is different from 20 years ago. This is, this is different. And then in 2010, and then we get the Tea Party wave election, which I thought was. At the time, I knew it was going to be intensely profound, and I don't use those words lightly, but the difference between that election in 1994, the 2010 census, that made gerrymandering, for some of the less restrained, Tea Party Republicans, they could just do what they wanted, and they did in a majority of states. That's why you have these weird blue states like, for nationally, for Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that have very strong Republican legislatures. It's got nothing to do with how people voted. It had everything to do with how those districts were gerrymandered. So you've got all those things. Oh, excuse me. All those things coming into this pot. And then I'll throw in the thing about Miss Rond, who I read 35 years ago, even longer. I first read The Fountainhead, and I thought, wow, this is cool. This is exciting. And I got excited. Mm-hmm. And then it wore off after about 15 minutes because I realized that type of idealism was, it fed right into your narcissism.
Yes.
And then I read Atlas Shrugged. And it was the same thing. And I thought that she had made a interesting ploy, essentially repeating Plato's Republic. except for the American economy, American capitalism, and totally unattainable. But it made you feel good because you're a genius, and you're an individual, and you don't need nobody, you don't need nothing, you just need your individual genius, and that's going to what separate. You know, it is very elitist, but it's a different kind of elite. It's an elite of just genius to those who don't. And
so you think your book is kind of the natural progression of all these things you've been naming.
So
up
all
to
these things, and then in 2009,
2018, I believe, is when the book is set.
And then also during that Tea Party thing, there was this John Galt, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand revival, and so I thought, now this is really interesting. So all these things are kind of percolating in my mind, and I was actually working on another project. I've been working on a play for a few years about Lyndon Johnson, who I was very lucky as a 9-year-old. I actually got to shake his hand back in 1964 when he was campaigning for president. And, you know, he was this big guy, and his hands were huge, and I was this little guy, and I was like, whoa. And I met him in Las Vegas, where I grew up. There's a cute little story there, you know, the sign of the University of Texas, hook 'em horns, you know, when you put your fingers apart. Well, my dad had said, say, hook 'em horns, Mr. President. And, you know, he's coming down the crowd, and now he makes eye contact, and he touches everybody. I mean, people he didn't know, didn't matter. He was just one of those big, affectionate, you know, people. So everything's happening fast, and I get one finger up, and I say, hook! And then he just, how you doing, boy? And then he's gone. Oh, well. So anyway, that's just one of the things that got me interested in politics, you know, when I was younger. But so all these things came together, and then in 2011, that's when it exploded, you know, for me, because first we had that interesting thing with they were going to default on the national debt.
Yeah, they're talking about doing that again.
I know, isn't that great? Isn't that great? I mean, I just find it unbelievable. And they're going to default on the national debt, which I thought, wow, this is different, because this is nihilism. This is anarchy, and it's nihilism. And essentially what they want to do is what, you know, Atlas Shrugged is all about. They want to just destroy it all and start over. And who knows what would happen to the national and world economy. And then a few months later, you know, we had the presidential debate. I think you've probably seen it in my press release or you know, in the story, about where they asked the question about, well, what do you do? Just let people die if they don't have health care? And I never assumed that, you know, all the people in the audience, you know, agreed, but there was a very loud minority that cheered about the idea of just letting people die.
That's pretty shocking.
It was. I was kind of stunned, but you know what?
This was a Republican debate. Let's make that clear.
Yeah, presidential debate in September of 2011, and the guy being asked the question was Ron Paul,
right?
And who seemed to be a good person to ask that, because
he's a doctor.
He's a doctor, and he's an extreme libertarian.
Right.
Well, he named his son Rand after
Ayn Rand.
Yeah. So something clicked right then, and I said, I didn't say to myself, but I was just thinking, you know, what do we do with that? And then I literally, within a week, I'm jotting down ideas, a public execution channel, like the Food Channel, but it's for profit, because people would cheer, and it would help states raise money, you know, because we're not going to tax anybody, so we might as well, you know, raise money. And then from there, you know, it kind of grew. I call it my theme menu, to this kind of cult of Ayn Rand, and you know, to free market economics, just restrained, and just eliminating the government altogether. So what I did is I took them at their word, and I mean them. I mean the nihilists. You know, one of the things that people have said, well, this is just a book for liberals. You're just a liberal who hates Republicans, and that's total nonsense to anybody who knows me, to anybody who's followed my writing and, you know, my reporting over the years. I'm a skeptic, but I'm not a conservative hater, and I don't have that. What I am concerned about is this kind of rampant nihilism wrapped up as a political ideology.
Well, what you've created here is their perfect world.
Yes.
Isn't that what they've been?
Well, I took them at their word.
Yes.
And so essentially, 5 years from now, unemployment rate is at 27, 28, 30%, and that's considered good because austerity is taking place and they're ripping apart they're essentially ripping apart the former structure, getting rid of government. Essentially, what the House Republicans are doing in Washington is kind of a prelude to my book, to where they just neuter Washington, D.C. and the federal government. And that's why I focus everything in my book on the states. In this sense, it's Texas, which, I mean, how could you resist Texas? I mean, it's just not possible. And California, and Washington, D.C. to a lesser extent. Well, the first character that popped up, and literally I wrote the first chapter in this amazing thing, is Governor Lawrence C. Demon Seed Bowie of the real American Republic of Texas. Now, you're going to say, real American? Well, it's too bad that the listeners couldn't see the book. They would see the new flag, and RA, which is Real America. And if you notice that the flag has been turned upside down, which is distress, which I think kind of reflects what this book is about. And so by 2018, when we meet, Governor Bowie, he's in a hell of a political fix because his war on the poor tax plan, in which he taxes the poor at 90%, and there's no taxes, and the rich are not taxed at all, so they cannot have to pay taxes. It just isn't working. The math isn't working. So he's in a little bit of trouble. Well, he's being challenged in a primary. How many times have we heard that about, Republican primaries from the right? Well, now it's not the Republican Party. The dominant party is the Real American Party. And he's being challenged by Texas militia Colonel Rufus T. Fairbush. Now, if that sounds like Rufus T. Firefly from Groucho Marx, I won't dispute that. But and now and Fairbush wants to take him out either by the ballot or the bullet, and he has the muscle to do it, because what's happened is, as government has disintegrated, private militias have filled the void, and essentially they've created these very economically efficient protection rackets, for every business budget. So,
Okay, so it's private police, private military that you buy on your own.
Yeah, exactly. And Texas is proud. The Real American Republic of Texas is proud because it leads the country in environmentally related deaths, which proves that their desire to get rid of all regulations and get rid of unions as well, just eliminate them because they're not economically efficient. All these things are working. And so all this is happening, and then you have this kind of character out in California in the new SoCal Liberty territory, because what's happening is America's breaking up into this kind of real America, which is that supports the Galtian imperatives. Again, nobody quite knows what they mean, but boy, they feel good. It's sort of like Paul Ryan, and his budget. Those are based on the Galtian imperatives. Totally incomprehensible. But man, boy,
it sounds good.
Hey, and not only that, but the mainstream media treats him like this is a serious economic guy.
He's a smart guy.
Yeah, which is a total joke. I mean, it's so absurd. That's why in my book I call it the same-stream media. I don't call it mainstream. I call it same-stream. And then out in the Liberty territory of SoCal, we've got this character called Jason Brovtart, who's a conservative reality TV. He's a Real American reality TV producer. He created the famous show Foreclosure Justice, which essentially was what it was essentially they took foreclosures because there's a new housing crisis in 2014, and they took the perspective from the bankers and the real estate, all the people that are involved in the other side, and treated them as heroes to dump the scofflaws.
So this is like a reality TV show where you can watch the
people getting thrown out of their houses, and then you have like
I'd watch that.
Yes, exactly. And so it's called Foreclosure Justice, and it becomes the most popular reality TV show in America. Well, he gets in a little trouble with his next show which is called The Real Homeless of Malibu Beach, in which he tries to expose the homeless as a hoax. And, because they're living in their nice cardboard boxes and they've got government issued cell phones that they can order Chinese food and pizza on. And plus they're also like, their votes are for sale. That's what they say on TV because they deserve stuff. And, we come to find out that, there are no homeless in Malibu Beach because they've all been, knocked out of town. And he gets criticized by the Galt Street Journal. And for being too unrealistic, because essentially these were paid actors pretending to be homeless and saying these things. So his career's in the dumps. Well, then we also have in the Liberty Territory of SoCal, Penelope the Psychic. Now she's very important because everything in the whole book turns on her. What's funny is that she's a refugee from East Germany. She was a former informant for the Stasi, the secret police, and she's gone through she's a con woman. She's a grifter. So she ends up in, Galtian territory in Southern California, and she's a psychic to wayward militia and real America politicians and stuff like that. Well, she gets roped in by Mr. Jones, who is truly the most feared security operator in real America. And essentially what he does, because now corporations are allowed to dispense their own kind of justice to consumers and media people who mean them harm, his business is booming because he's got his own private army, he's got his own private intelligence service. Again, it's all been privatized. Right. And then we have an interesting person called James Big Steak Frimmer, who is essentially this billionaire financier whose goal in life is essentially to buy every politician who can possibly be bought and have them, do their good stuff. So he has 20 think tanks, essentially coming out with these studies that say that, it's important to boost up the morale of the guardians of Galt and the makers, because if they don't, the whole economy will suffer if we don't give them tax cuts and treat them with the respect that they deserve. So all these things come together, and then Bravtart Jason, who's down on his luck, all of a sudden has this revelation about the Execution Channel, which is, it's not only, a for-profit food-like channel for public executions, but it's also a Ponzi investment scheme, so they can raise money. And so all these things come together, and then you've got the first guy that's chosen to be the ex-sub, and now these are public executions in football stadiums. And focus group tested methods of execution.
Oh my gosh.
And, there's a whole list of them. I mean, being torn apart by a specialty breed of Rottweilers, guillotine, hanging, being torn apart by 50 caliber machine guns, all the stuff that you can imagine that would be great for TV. And then you have this ritual of people confessing and then saying, they're sorry and that this is all good for real America and the Galtian imperatives that they are sacrificed, and and then it just goes on, and then you get to it's all very interesting. I've been told that it starts out laugh out loud funny, and then it becomes obviously a little dark. I'm sure you can imagine that.
Yes.
And then there's hope at the end. For Bowie and the supporters of the Galtian imperatives, because paradise is close at hand.
Wow.
It sounds like an
I'm looking forward to
amazing
reading it.
book.
Yes.
I could see it being made into a movie, to tell you the truth. Well, that is so. Does John Galt does not make an appearance in the book?
No.
Just his imperatives.
Oh, there's statues of John Galt everywhere in real America. And and in fact, one government official was essentially thrown out of his job when he said that John Galt shouldn't have a statue next to the Washington Monument, in Washington D.C. John Galt is the deity. He's the reigning deity, essentially. People talk about him. Bowie, when he was in Congress, by the way, I forgot to say about his 3 terms in Congress, is that he was head of the Imbecile Caucus. And, they were essentially, they talked about conspiracies all the time, and fact-free statements was their stock and trade, and so Bowie was in Washington D.C. Well, he found that reading reading Ayn Rand was difficult, so he hired a staff person, kind of a Galtian seer, to help him get the Galtian perspective on the daily events of the day. And then when he became governor of Texas, of the real American Republic of Texas, he also hired a staff person to kind of guide him to the Galtian perspective on daily events and stuff like that. So, and then obviously we have the Galtian imperatives, which are, like I've mentioned before, this economic religion that, doesn't really, people don't understand it. And I think, if I can quote myself in the book, it's like biblical in its essence and transcendent in purpose. It just is.
Yeah.
It just is. And then we have the guardians of Galt, who are the richest of the rich and the most successful, and then we have things like happening. Everything gets changed because when Galt mania takes hold, or it's called, in my book, it's called the Galtian Awakening. We find that there's the Galt Street Journal, the Galt News Channel, and all sorts of Galtian institutes to spread the word. And if that looks like it's connected to the right wing conservative entertainment and education complex, well, it is in a way. So I think that one of the things that I've done is I've taken the headlines of today. I think I sent you something yesterday.
Yes.
That guy is a dead ringer for Rufus T.
Tell our listeners what you're referring to.
Well, I could pick up almost anything every day.
Yeah.
Whether it's something zany somebody said, or yesterday in Salon there was a story about the craziest police chief in America, who wants to shoot libtards, and create his own militias, and proudly has pictures taken of him with his AK-47s with these huge 100 round drums and stuff like that. Well, he's right out of my book.
Yeah.
Really?
He's not like, I read him, but this guy's name is Mark Kessler from Pennsylvania. It was like a made-up character, but he's real.
Yeah. And so, he's a dead ringer for, Rufus T. Fairbush, who was also elected county sheriff 5 times, and, was a known, well, let's just put it this way. He was a strong entrepreneur in terms of the criminal activities he was involved in, including a very innovative, protection racket. And so you have all these things, like, for example, Jason Brovtart's, wife, Sandra, or Sandy, as she's called in the book, she is the chief marketing officer for the John Galt Militia, which is the biggest one in Southern California. And she comes up with these great ideas, for example, of televising, like a YouTube channel of interrogations of anti-Galtian heretics and stuff like that, which are like a new entertainment and revenue-enhancing device. So, like I said, it gets dark, but it's also funny, and I've taken the headlines of today and kind of, I guess, juiced them up on kind of literary steroids, if that's a good way to put it, and imagine what it might be like, in 5 years if this came to pass, because there is a cost when our political rhetoric becomes so incoherent and there's no accountability for it, and when our public policy just essentially sinks into this morass of, we are, essentially undermining, the bonds that keep us together as a country and, and as a society. So essentially what I did is just created this kind of, obviously it's a dystopia, but this is the world that this brand of kind of nihilism and rampant narcissism, this is what they want.
Well, Mike, let me ask you, did you get any inspiration, if that's the right word, from the Free State Project here in New Hampshire for this book? Because they seem to fit right into this model.
Well, I would say yes. Excuse me. I would say yes. to them, but also the kind of the Tea Party wave that took over in 2011, and that brought together a whole bunch of crazies, but also some serious Republicans who were like, "Oh my God, what's happening here?" And for example, I think we all remember the first thing that Bill O'Brien and the leadership did: guns in the State House. The first thing,
Right.
like this is 1870 or something.
Right.
But even in Dodge, back in the the Wild West days, you had to give up your gun when you crossed the town limits. I mean, this showed me that they weren't serious about governing, but they were serious about exerting their power to delegitimize government and essentially cut public funding for higher education. To what end? To what end? And the point is, there is no end. That is the point. Is that they can do it and they believe in it. And so, in answer to the question, yes. Let's just put it this way: a few of the characters and their kind of colorful comments, definitely, they were in my head. But you know what? They're all over the country. They are truly all over the country, which is why I focus this on the states, because that's where it's really happening. That's where these elections matter more than ever.
Our guest this morning is Michael McCord, journalist and author. He's written a new book called The Execution Channel, A Political Fable. And Michael, I don't know if you watched the news last night and heard about what's going on in North Carolina. It sounds exactly like this book. It's like people who hate government and love guns and hate women have taken over and disregarded what the people of the state want and are passing crazy laws that I find very distressing.
Again, that's an example of what's happening in the states. Whatever whatever the National Party is saying about how they have to have outreach and and stuff like that at the state level, North Carolina, you've got North Carolina, you've got Wisconsin, you've got Michigan, you've got Texas. Obviously, what happened there, where it didn't work once, it didn't work twice, but by God, we're going to do what we can to essentially shut down abortion in the state. But North Carolina is amazing because it was considered a relatively moderate state.
Yes.
But they know their time is limited. They don't trust the voters and what's going to happen in 2014. And so they're doing this. I mean, the anti-abortion bill is right out of my book in terms of the comedy of it, put in as part of a motorcycle safety. Excellent. I mean, that's truly bizarre. As an amendment, this stuff in Ohio. Now, I don't think people realize what happened in Ohio because it happened so fast. All of a sudden, all these anti-abortion bills just popped up, never debated, no hearings, no nothing. They were put in as part of the budget. So essentially, you've got these pieces of the Ohio abortion bills, which are not they're not even together. They're like separate pieces in the state budget. And so the governor had a choice he had a choice because they have a line item veto in Ohio, but he chose not to do it. But that's another example. Now what happens in my book is exactly that. The voter suppression stuff. Mm-hmm. I had a feeling that the Supreme Court was going to overturn the Voting Rights Act. And so I thought, what would happen if that would happen? Well, essentially, 40% of the voters, for example, in Texas, are just disqualified for. There's birth requirements, there's income requirements, and also ethnic requirements. So I've got this scene where Bowie is talking to his driver, his African American driver, and the guy goes, "What happened to my voting rights?" And Bowie says, "Well, don't take it personally. This isn't really about race and all those nasty things people say." But, the Liberty Court, it's no longer the Supreme Court, by the way. It's the Liberty Court. The Liberty Court has deemed that, because there's so many of you were endangering our rights as a party to exist. So, we are allowed to do these things. Now, if you and your urban kind had voted the right way, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Now, I'm using language, obviously, that's that's already been, that's out there. And but so essentially this is how the real American Party seizes power.
Yeah.
They just chop and chop and chop. For example, in Texas, in my real American Republic of Texas, you have essentially what Bowie does is essentially chops the legislature in half because it's more economically efficient. And the senators and the House members are forced to get corporate sponsors, so the taxpayers don't have to pay their salaries. And he signs a 10-year, I was going to say $1 million, but I forgot to tell you is that there's also a new currency called RAC, the real American currency. Essentially, they've just gotten rid of the old stuff and defaulted on all the debts and just said, you guys go away. We're not going to pay you. We're starting over, which is also right out of Atlas Shrugged. And so essentially what he's done, he signs a 10-year, $100 million deal with Hudsucker Oil to essentially sponsor the governor's seat. And his thought is, if you've been vetted properly by the corporations, then you're worthy. Yeah. And then the voters will know. But if you haven't, if you can't get a corporate sponsor, you don't deserve to be in office. And then I've got all these think tanks that justify this stuff, not through like logic or not through serious analysis or even facts, but through the fact that they say so. They say so.
Yeah, all these things you're saying, Michael, they seem absurd, but when you look at the rhetoric of the Republican Party and the Tea Parties, you're just extrapolating exactly what they're saying. And, get rid of taxes and let business take over and let the marketplace take over. And that's exactly that's what makes it, I'm sure, funny, but maybe a little scary.
Well, I've got that. I mean, I've gotten that feedback where I've heard creepy, I've heard it makes you cringe, and I've heard chilling, and I've heard dark, but people kept turning the pages because all through this there's actually a story here. Believe it or not. I know it seems like this is some kind of political polemic. I'm just spouting off. Actually, no. And here, I guess liberals, progressives, Democrats, they don't matter in this world. So they're not really very much at all a part of the conversation, because one of the things I've always been interested in is this kind of hermetically sealed, self-enclosed world that, this nihilistic group of politicians and their supporters live in. And again, this goes back to if you read Atlas Shrugged, essentially that's Galt's Gulch, which was this creation of this hermetically sealed place for geniuses. Essentially, all these industrials just disappear, if you remember the book, and they go to Galt's Gulch, and essentially they do other things, but they're just kind of keeping their genius in reserve until America falls apart, and then they're called upon to come back.
How can people get your book, Michael?
Well, it's online. If you go to, first of all, I'm a big believer in buy local. To be honest, it cuts into my royalties. But River Run Bookstore, has it on sale, as does Water Street Bookstore in Exeter. And you can also go to my website, which is www.the-execution-channel.com. There's links to Amazon and to another, e-site that they can get it as well. We're hoping to spread the word, so we can have more book states in the region and throughout the state, and hopefully the country, and then the world. Eventually, this book will take over the world. So we're starting small. We're starting talking to folks like you, working on getting stories out. People look at the title and they say, "What is this about?" But this is just a metaphor. It's truly just a metaphor. And once you get into the book, you realize, what it is. It's a metaphor for everything else that's happening, behind the scenes.
Well, Mike, I was just wondering if you've read other political satire books, if any of them had any influence or anything. Because I've read some of the books by Christopher Buckley, which are political satire, and some of those are quite funny.
Well, you've thanked Jonathan Swift, I see, in your book, The Ultimate Political Satirist.
There's Swift. If I could just take a look at the book here, I think there's Swift, and obviously Voltaire, Candide. And there's Joseph Heller, Catch-22. In fact, there's a shout out. I don't know if you remember